Okay, so in today's video, I wanted to talk about 5 things that I want to see in the new Resident Evil Death Island movie that's releasing in a couple of weeks. Now, it is worth noting that I don't think that everything on my list is actually going to happen in the movie. A lot of it is out there, but I still wanted to talk about it, so that's what we're going to be discussing. All right, so for starters, the first thing I'd actually love to see is a mention of Carlos. Now, of course, it's no surprise that Resident Evil Death Island's cast for the movie is really jam-packed. So I'm not really talking about actually seeing another main character added to the whole roster. That's not what I'm talking about here. If anything, the only thing that I actually want to see with Carlos is a mention. I want to see if the character is alive and well. Did he join the BSAA? What's he up to? You know, that's what I basically want to see. I hope that in the new Resident Evil Death Island, we just get like a short maybe conversation with him and Jill. Because again, we have not seen Carlos Oliveira since 1998, since the events of Raccoon City's outbreak. So, you know what? It's been a long time since we've actually heard any bit of news regarding Carlos. So I just want to see if, you know, we get a glimpse of Carlos. Just a small glimpse. As mentioned, I'm not asking for like a whole cameo or something along those lines. Now, don't get me wrong. If something like that does happen, I'm going to be super happy. But just to keep it realistic, I think just a mention or maybe just like a phone conversation that just gets interrupted because the story's happening. Something along those lines that we know that Carlos is alive and well. Now, staying on the theme of characters that we haven't seen in a while, another character that almost made an appearance in Resident Evil Infinite Darkness was Billy. Now, of course, if you guys watched my video on that, you know, the director and the producer, Hiroyuki Kobayashi, they really tried to add Billy into the story. If anything, I'm pretty sure their plans was to add and incorporate Billy's story into the Panam Stamps part of the movie. But at the end of the day, they just couldn't fit him in the story. I don't know why they couldn't do that. You know, it was kind of a shame. Another thing that I actually didn't really like about Infinite Darkness was the fact that we saw Ashley's photo and they kind of gave us a moment there. You know, when you have that scene where President Graham kind of just turns around and looks at Ashley's photo. I didn't really like that part. I think it would have been a lot better if we actually got a scene of Ashley, you know, walking down the halls of, you know, the White House, and then Leon's there, you know, and then they can have a quick chat. I thought that would have been something that I actually wanted to see, and that's something that I was actually theorizing before. But what we ended up getting was just a picture of Ashley. Now, I guess the reason we didn't have like a full scene or cameo in Resident Evil Infinite Darkness, even though it was so easy to add into the whole show, was probably because, you know, they didn't have a voice actor for Ashley. Resident Evil 4 Remake did not release, you know, during that time. So maybe that's the reason. But going back to the topic, I think it would be really interesting if we actually got a glimpse of Billy again. Because you know what? They wanted to add him in Resident Evil Infinite Darkness. Now, it is worth mentioning Resident Evil Infinite Darkness does take place 2 years after the events of Resident Evil 4, which is in 2006. And Resident Evil Death Island it seems like it's going to be taking place in 2015. It could be 2016. So there's a lot of years there, you know what I mean? But I definitely want to see a glimpse of Billy. Much like in the same way that I want to see a cameo of either Carlos, right? Just like a quick phone call or just like a quick mention of the character. Maybe he's working for the BSAA. I think it would be really interesting and really cool to see if that happens also with Billy. You know, is Billy working for the BSAA? What is he up to? What's he doing? You know what I mean? Because the last time we left Billy he was on the run, essentially. You know, he was actually supposed to go to jail in the events of Resident Evil 0, but, you know, Rebecca let him escape after, you know, he helped Rebecca, you know, go through that whole ordeal, all of the events that occur in Resident Evil 0. So we do know for a fact that Billy did escape, but what's he up to? You know, these are all questions that I definitely want to know the answers to. So if we could just get a small glimpse, a small mention, I'm not asking for a cameo, I'd be super happy. Now, the third thing that I actually want to see, and you know what? This was actually rumored. So this could potentially occur in the Resident Evil Death Island movie. But what I'm referring to is seeing Ada Wong again. Now, when details for Resident Evil Death Island started coming out, there was also rumors attached to those details stating that Ada Wong might show up in this movie. Now, it's quite interesting if we do end up seeing Ada Wong, because as mentioned, this movie does take place in 2015. And we haven't seen Ada Wong, you know, after the events of Resident Evil 6, which of course take place in 2012 and 2013. So it would actually be really nice if we actually got a mention or a look at Ada after the events of Resident Evil 6. Now, we almost did get Ada in Resident Evil 8 Village. There was a whole concept art that they were basically working on. It seems like they were really theorizing and trying to come up with an idea to fit Ada into the story of Resident Evil 8 Village. Now, of course, we know for a fact that never ended up happening, but it would be interesting to see Ada after so many years because, you know, Resident Evil 6 did come out in 2012 and we haven't really seen her again. We've only seen her in remakes, of course, Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil 4, but we haven't seen her, you know, in present day. So, of course, it is worth mentioning that Resident Evil Death Island does take place, I think, in 2015. 2015, but it would be nice, 2 years after the events of Resident Evil 6. Number 4. So the other thing that I really want to see in Resident Evil Death Island is a mention or an explanation as to Jill's whereabouts. I want to know more about Jill's backstory, what happened between the events of Resident Evil 5, which of course take place in 2009, and all the way up until the movie actually starts, which I'm assuming is 2015 or 2016. So what ended up happening in those couple of years? The last time we actually got an official notice or an official mention of Jill's whereabouts was in Revelations 2. Revelations 2, which I think takes place in 2010, we can actually find a secret file where Jill talks with Barry and kind of just mentions that she's just been going through testing and stuff. This was right after, a year after the events of Resident Evil 5, so she's just been hospitalized. They've been checking up on her and stuff, and she was finding it really boring to stay there. And since this is the first time we're seeing Jill after so many years, as mentioned, we last saw her officially in 2009, I really want to know what happened to her. What has she been up to? It is worth noting that, after watching the trailers and stuff, it does seem likely that Jill went back to the BSAA and that's what she's been doing. She's been working with them. But how come Jill wasn't in Resident Evil 6? Which take place in 2012 and 2013. How come she wasn't working with the BSAA? How come when Chris was going through his whole ordeal with losing his whole squad in Edonia, how come Jill didn't, help him? How come she didn't come there and, and say hi to him and say, like, well, what are you doing? Like, get back up on your feet. We didn't get any of that in Resident Evil 6. If anything, Pierce kind of took that role. So, again, she didn't appear in those events. She didn't appear in China, right, in Resident Evil 6 2013. So, what has she been up to? It's also worth noting she did not show up in Resident Evil 7, which takes place in 2017. So again, there's a lot of areas where Jill did not show up. And even in the previous movie that, takes place a year before Resident Evil Death Island is Resident Evil Vendetta. Jill was nowhere to be seen there. So what has she been up to? Has she just been, is Resident Evil Death Island like the first time that she's gone back to the Force? Or not the Force, but, the BSAA? Is this like her returning? Are we going to be seeing that? These are all questions that I want to have an answer to, because to be honest, we have not seen this character in so many years. She's been missing. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm super hyped that Jill is returning because she's like literally the main character for Resident Evil, Chris and Jill, and we've had so many mentions of Chris, but Jill over the years we have had zero mentions. So that's one of the things that I'm super hyped about, and I hope we get a good explanation as to what she's been up to, what she's been doing, how has she dealt with the whole thing of being basically used as an experimented on for 3 years from 2006 to 2009, the events of Resident Evil 5. And the other thing that I also would like to see is maybe a mention of Parker Luciani, from Revelations. Parker and Jill's relationship was actually pretty close. I actually really like Parker's character in Revelations. I think it would be really interesting if we actually got a glimpse of him or a mention, just like I mentioned with Carlos and Billy. But of course, I think Billy and seeing Carlos again are way more important than seeing Parker. Now, the last thing that I actually want to see for number 5 in the new Resident Evil Death Island movie is a mention of Claire and Leon's relationship. Now, if we guys remember, at the end of Resident Evil Infinite Darkness, again, that took place in 2006, they kind of left off in a rocky state. Both Claire and Leon seemed like they were really upset at each other. We never see the duo kind of return and kind of help each other out after those events of Resident Evil Infinite Darkness. We don't see them again working together. So it seems to me that they probably broke their friendship after the events of Resident Evil Infinite Darkness, because at the end they were really upset at each other, especially since Claire at the end of Resident Evil Infinite Darkness wanted to expose everything that was happening, with what one of the senators was doing. I'm pretty sure it was a senator, right? Or I think he was also like a general or whatever. Wanted to expose that to the world and basically the plan that he had. But of course, Leon did not want to expose that because of what Mad Dog essentially told them. He didn't want people to get scared. So if anything, it seems like both of them just had different ways of dealing with what occurred in the events of Resident Evil Infinite Darkness. So now that we're seeing Claire and Leon working together again, I kind of want to see a mention of that. Like, what's been happening? Are they still friends? Were they still friends after the events of Resident Evil Infinite Darkness? Or did they take a couple of years off and then they rekindled their friendship or something like that? Like, I'm really curious to see, because I think that if we don't get any mention of that, then I guess you would just assume that they just became friends after. I mean, of course, Resident Evil Infinite Darkness again takes place in 2006. This Resident Evil Death Island seems like it's going to be taking place in 2015. So there's a lot of years there. You know what I mean? So I don't know the specifics, but I want to know. I want them to mention mention something along those lines. Like, you remember when I was upset at you in Infinite Darkness? Oh yeah, you were, you weren't really nice during that time. Something along those lines, so that we know that they're friends again and they're cool. Now, if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to click this video where I dissect the latest Resident Evil Death Island trailer. Anyways, thank you so much for watching.